Well, it is fully 10 o'clock, at least according to my clock on the computer. So I think we will make a start. It's my real pleasure to welcome Stephen Lloyd, who is going to give us our first talk today. Dr. Lloyd had his degree, or got his degree, in Cambridge University. He's done physics and theology in his career, and he is a pastor at Gravesend in that wonderful area east of London, or just part of London, but anyway, there by the river. And he does, he also works with Biblical Creation Trust, which is the organization that Paul and he primarily do their creation work through. He's the author of a book which has already been mentioned, but I'll leave him to plug that. It's all about Adam, which he's going to talk about. Adam, human identity and some cosmological implications. Over to you, Stephen.
Okay, thank you. Let's try sharing the screen.
Yes, let's do.
There we go. Can you all see that?
We can, yes.
Yep, clear.
Right, okay. Well, one of the most difficult issues I think you'll encounter as a Christian student is origins. And the biggest difficulty you'll have is not with the atheists in science departments, but actually fellow Christians in your Christian union or in the church, your friends, people you agree with, people you work with on so much else, but who think it's not a problem to combine the Bible with evolutionary history. And I was encouraged that someone in one of the discussion groups yesterday said that was exactly the case. That was where it was the most difficult. So how do we respond? And I think the key thing is to be asking the right questions. If you begin with sort of, well, what's the genre of Genesis 1, or even how long are the days, I don't think you're going to get very far, and people won't understand why it matters so much. So what I tried to introduce last year was that the sort of central issue in the origins debate is actually nothing to do with fossils or anything else. It's this simple question: why did Jesus have to die? That is actually at heart what it's about. It's about a history of death, and that is why this topic matters. And if you want to see more on that, have a look at, there's a paper you can find online called Chronological Creationism, and we've also republished it as this booklet with a different title, Adam or Death, which came first, and I'll show you a link how you can actually download that from our website at the end of the talk. And this will also cover some of the things I'm talking about today. So that was last year. This year I want to focus on the question, who is human? How do I know if you or I are human? Now, of course, a scientist would classify us as Homo sapiens, but you don't find that term in the Bible. What does it mean, biblically speaking, to be human? Well, if you read through Genesis 1, you'll find there are lots of similarities between mankind and the animals. But there is one thing that marks out mankind from the animals, and it's this fact that we've been made in God's image. Genesis 1:27, so God created man in his own image, in the image of God he created him, male and female, he created them. That is what makes human beings unique. And we could spend all day discussing what the image of God means, but I think the context, at very least, makes clear three things that this is about. It's telling us we've been made by God. We are not God, we are dependent creatures, and yet we are like God. We resemble God at some level. There are things about us that mean we can relate to God. And this is the third thing: we are made for God. We've been made to know him, to serve him. We've been made even to sort of act as his deputies, ruling in creation. And another way to understand what this sort of our human identity means is to think of it as a network of relationships. We are physical people who are part of a physical world, and yet we are also spiritual people with a unique relationship to God. And we are also people of community. We are not simply individuals, but we are defined by our relationships with one another. Part of what makes me unique is my particular set of family relationships. No one else has the same parents and siblings as me. So in this sort of understanding of our identity, we can see that our identity is something given. It's received as a gift. It's not something we make for ourselves. And because it's something given, it's something fixed, it's something stable. And that is in total contrast to how our culture today understands our identity. What our culture today says is you are fundamentally an individual. You are isolated and you create your own identity. Your identity is something you achieve, not something received, because who on earth could you receive it from? It's just you. And it means that your identity is therefore something ever changing. It's unstable. It's a bit like a cloud that actually is blown along, not simply by what you think, by what everyone else around you thinks. You choose and create your own identity. And this sort of understanding of who we are is incredibly practical. The sort of topics that debates today center around, everything from transgenderism to exam pressure actually center on this issue of identity, of who we are. And having the wrong view of human identity leads to enormous problems. It leads to terrible insecurity and anxiety. So this is an incredibly sort of practical issue. And what I want to show is how this relates to origins. And if you want a bit more on just this beginning bit, you can listen to a slightly sort of scratchy recording of a talk I did in 2017, the Answers in Genesis mega conference. So I expand more on what I've just said so far. But for now, what's all this got to do with origins? Every Christian I know would agree that human beings are made in the image of God. But how do I know if I am human? Because the Bible doesn't talk about this scientific classification of Homo sapiens. So how do you answer this question of who is human? Well, the answer depends on what you believe about origins. And it's not just us that we need to worry about. What do we do with all these fossils? What do we do with hominin fossils? Now, in the picture here, these are replicas, but they are replicas of real fossils of what I believe to be real creatures. Now, I know there's been frauds down history. There's been things like the Piltdown Man, but these fossils are real. They're not invented by an evolutionary conspiracy. Now, if we arrange them in a tree like this, that is putting an evolutionary interpretation on them, but their existence is a fact. This isn't something made up. So how on earth do we explain them as Christians believing the Bible? In particular, which of these fossils are human? Let me put the question in a different way. Which of these fossils would you have evangelized? We don't preach the gospel to a dog or to an ape. So which of these needed to hear the gospel? Let's look at a couple of these in more detail. Neanderthals, these are my favorite. I love these because they are, in part because they're named after a German pastor, the hymn writer Joachim Neander, the author of the hymn Praise to the Lord, the Almighty, the King of Creation, named indirectly after him. A valley was named after him, the Neander Valley, and later on, some centuries later, these fossils were found, and that's why they're called Neanderthals. But I'd love to have some fossils named after me. Anyway, they died out around 25,000 years ago in the evolutionary chronology, but they've been around for many hundreds of thousands of years before that. And what we discover, and we investigate the archaeology of these people, is that they had a very advanced culture. Tools, clothes, jewelry, music even. They buried their dead with artifacts. Well, why would you do that? Presumably if you believe in some sort of afterlife. And intriguingly, they interbred with Homo sapiens, as in modern humans, us. So most modern Europeans and Asians have Neanderthal genes in them. Most of us here participating in this conference have Neanderthal DNA in us. And this, I think, just brings this home. This isn't just some distant, irrelevant topic. We're talking about real people here. This fossil that we're looking at here, this one could be your ancestor. How do we deal with them? And there was a program on the BBC in 2018. The BBC gets a lot of flack from creationists, but to me, this program was just brilliant because it just talked about how Neanderthals were so much like us. They even got one, did a sort of a likeness of one, dressed him up and stuck him on the tube. And you wouldn't really have noticed any difference. They were so similar to us. So that's Neanderthals. What about Homo erectus? Well, these appear about 2 million years ago in the evolutionary timescale. Similar anatomy to us, again, sophisticated use of tools. It seems they used fire in a controlled way for cooking. You don't get that with any animal. They created shelters. And there's increasing evidence of travel, of long-range dispersal across open water. And when you think about it, that takes a lot of capability. It takes a lot of capability to cross open water, a lot of planning, a lot of curiosity. And in fact, the more we find out, the more advanced capabilities we find further and further back in time. So how do we relate all this to what it means to be the image of God for both ourselves and, for example, these other ancient hominids? Well, there are lots of different approaches amongst evangelicals, but they basically boil down to two models. And both of these agree that Adam was a real historical individual. You know, many Christians are convinced by what Paul says in Romans 5, 1 Corinthians 15, that Adam had to be a historical individual. And that point isn't actually what divides us, that is actually a point of agreement. So simply saying you believe in a historical Adam doesn't actually distinguish the two views I'm going to show you now. The first view is what I believe, that Adam was uniquely created, he had no parents, and he was initially alone. There were no other people like him. Humanity is then defined as all the people who are physically descended from Adam. And I'm going to come back to that later. But what I focus on first is the second view. And this is what is widely held amongst evangelicals. And this is saying that Adam was originally surrounded by a population of creatures who were essentially physically identical to him. For example, his parents. He had parents. And the idea is that this population of people were essentially physically, emotionally, intellectually the same as us. And God chose one of that population, called him Adam, and gave him this special status of representing the whole of humanity. Gave him a new spiritual status at this point, where he became the image of God, became in fellowship with God. So in this view, we should understand the physical origins of humanity from evolutionary history. We are the product of descent with modification from earlier creatures. That's our physical origins. But the spiritual status of humanity is this idea that we're the image of God, and that is something conferred on one of these creatures, Adam. And on the face of it, it all sounds very simple and convenient. You can keep evolutionary history and the unique biblical status of humanity and a historical Adam. You know, what's not to like? Well, actually quite a lot if you start thinking about it more carefully. Crucially, if Adam is living alongside others who are essentially physically identical to him, people who are physically human, that means I am not necessarily a descendant of Adam. I might be a descendant of one of those other people around him, one of the blue figures there in my diagram. And that changes how we understand what it means to be the image of God. Let's just look at that. If Adam is just one among many, then the image of God is something added. Adam is born with a body. He is physically the same as those around him. He thinks, he sings, he plans, he designs tools, he makes up stories. He is physically, emotionally, intellectually, essentially the same as us, but exists as part of his life with those capabilities, but without being the image of God. So he can do all of those things without being God's image. The image of God is simply a status that's conferred on him by God. It's not intrinsic to his created identity. Or to put it another way, he exists quite happily without being the image of God. And this means the image of God is something arbitrary. Adam is given this status, but what about all those people around him who are physically similar and with similar capabilities? There's nothing unique about Adam. The third problem is, who else is the image of God? And of course, this really matters, because if you're not truly human in a biblical sense, unless you are the image of God, it matters quite a lot who else is the image of God. Adam is the image of God because God decrees it. What about the people around him? What about Eve, for example? If she isn't the image of God, then biblically speaking, Adam is marrying an animal. You've redefined marriage. What about Adam's parents? If they are not human, if they are not the image of God, then again, they are also animals. You could have eaten them. And what about us here today? If the image of God is something conferred by divine decree, how do I know that applies to me or to you? I don't have access to God's decrees. And you can see how this could get really nasty. You could decide that someone else or a group of people are not, in fact, the image of God. If I'm not physically descended from Adam, what is the basis of my link with Adam? Who else does Adam represent? You know, we have this idea of being in Adam, what's called sort of federal headship in Christian theology. But that doctrine is in trouble here. It's very easy to say, oh yes, Adam's the representative head, but the representative head of whom? You can't simply use a modern scientific definition of humanity. Paul didn't have that. You need a biblical definition. And this is where this idea comes into such problems. And there's also real moral problems with this view. Animals are violent. Hominins are violent. So therefore, Adam and his contemporaries grow up naturally violent. But as an animal, before he is the image of God, he's not morally accountable. He could kill another hominin without that being sin. But once he becomes God's image, brought into a relationship with God, he is morally accountable. Violence is now sin. And so you could think, well, his new status hardly seems to be a blessing. You almost wouldn't want to be the chosen one in this situation, because now he is held eternally accountable for actions that he could practice innocently before he was the image of God. And how does this work for all the people that Adam represents? You know, if Adam is there in the ancient Near East, what about all the other human beings in Australia at that time? Do they suddenly become accountable for their violence at the same time? And Adam could argue this, I think. If, you know, why is Adam being held accountable for violence when that is how God originally made him? If God made this world full of violence in the beginning, you could even argue that Adam is actually imaging God rather well in being violent. So there's a problem with the morality of this. And there's also a real issue with sexuality. Remember, Adam is not made as the image of God. His image of godness is something spiritual that has nothing to do with Adam's body. That leaves a problem with sexual identity. Let's go back to Genesis 1:27. Look at the statements that are in parallel here. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. It seems to me if the image of God is something purely spiritual, not rooted in anything physical, then the same must apply to the male and femaleness. It is not something rooted in our bodies. Well, of course, that is exactly what transgender ideology says. I think that's a real problem. And what I'm trying to show you here is that what you believe about Adam, what you believe about human evolution, directly impacts one of the biggest apologetic issues we face today. You know, people think this issue of origins is just a side issue that's unrelated to lots of other things. It is central in our apologetic to all sorts of issues. If we go wrong on this creation one, it will become far harder to deal with so many other apologetic issues. This issue of transgenderism, but also the issues of suffering and other things that we've thought about at other points in this conference. So it sounds so easy to say that God chose Adam out of an existing population, but it's a theological and apologetic nightmare. It works much better if you stick with the Bible's pattern, where Adam has no parents. You see, this works because of this. We're told in 1 Corinthians 15:49 that we have borne the image of the earthly man. Well, how have we borne that image? How is it that we share the image of Adam? Well, we're told in Genesis chapter 5, where it says God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. And then what do we see about Adam? He had a son in his own likeness, in his own image. Do you see what's going on there? Adam's identity is shared with his physical descendants. And I think that is telling us a very clear, simple definition of what it means to be human. To be human, to be the image of God, is to be a descendant from Adam. And so that means our spiritual status, if you like, has an objective physical basis. One of the things I think we need to recapture is the physicality of Christianity. We spiritualize everything far too much. We have a beautifully earthy God who was made flesh. We need to really capture that and make that have the right place in our theology. We just love to make everything just spiritual. Christianity brings the physical and spiritual together in a way that no other religion does. Those that Adam represents are all humanity, namely his descendants. And whose family is Jesus born into? Well, it's into Adam's family, we're told in Luke chapter 3. In other words, Jesus shares my humanity, which is why he can act as my substitute, why he can be my kinsman redeemer in that imagery of the Old Testament. If we're not all descended from Adam, how do I know that Jesus shared my humanity? And it also means that Adam is made from the beginning of his existence as the image of God. The image of God is something that applies to Adam as a whole, body and soul. The whole person is the image of God. And you think, but hang on a minute, if I'm saying his body images God, how does that work? God doesn't have a body. But God is described as doing things that we accomplish with our bodies. Psalm 94 verse 9, does he who implanted the ear not hear? Does he who formed the eye not see? In other words, we can still image God with our bodies. There is a significance to our bodies. That's why we believe in the resurrection of the body. Again, Christians are sometimes too dismissive about our bodies. Oh, it's just bodies that will just die and rot. No, our bodies will be raised to life again. Jesus's body was the image of God, not just his soul, as it were. His whole person is the image of God. So there's all sorts of implications to the incarnation here, but let's not get sidetracked onto that. How does all this work with dating? When we think of our fossil friends, and here I mean dating in the sense of age, not who you can marry. And remember, the issue here is not which species of these being classified by under modern science, but which of these are descendants of Adam. How does this play into the whole issue of the age of the earth and dating? Well, let's come back to our Neanderthals. What if Neanderthals existed before Adam? Maybe they were part of this population that Adam was living alongside. Well, the problem with that is that you have to say that they are not, biblically speaking, humans, because they're not descendants from Adam. And yet, how do you reconcile that with the spiritual behavior they show, their advanced culture? You know, animals don't wear clothes. And more worryingly still, what about all of us people here watching this seminar who are descended from interbreeding with Neanderthals? We are the fruits of bestiality. What is the spiritual status of a part human, part animal? I don't know. That seems to me is quite a big problem if you start to say that you have these Neanderthals before Adam. So let's take a different track. Let's say, okay, we have Neanderthals after Adam to avoid those problems. In that case, if Adam is before the Neanderthals, they could in principle be his descendants. They could be human. But where do you then place Adam? I said the Neanderthals died out 25,000 years ago in the evolutionary chronology, but they actually go back hundreds of thousands of years. 500,000 years is probably the branching point from Homo sapiens. So you'd have to place Adam hundreds of thousands of years ago in order to be before the Neanderthals. But why stop there? What about our Homo erectus friends? Remember, they're not so different to us. If they're human, they must also be descended from Adam, which means you're going to have to place Adam more than 2 million years ago. And I don't know anyone who thinks you can have a historical Adam going back 2 million years. You can't stretch the genealogies back that far. Adam can't be historical in that biblical sense if you're placing Adam that far ago. In other words, if you want to be able to say that humanity is descended from Adam, and an awful lot hangs on that, about our identity, remember what I said at the beginning, if you want to be able to say that, if you want to be able to say that Neanderthals, Homo erectus, are also human, then you have to question the evolutionary timescale. simply from this issue of hominin fossils. You don't even have to start thinking about animals and all the rest. Simply from this issue, you have very strong grounds to question the evolutionary timescale. And more positively, you're going to need a different biblical model to explain these fossils. Again, we can't just ignore them. We can't just pretend they're some sort of invention of evolution. They're not. These are real fossils, real people. This is really interesting. How do we explain them? And I think we can start to explain them not as people that were around alongside Adam, but actually people that existed after the flood. What we're seeing here in these fossils is evidence of how humanity diversified and spread out after the flood. But that's another talk. As is the final 4 minutes I've got for you here. I was originally asked to sort of cover physics as well as theology, which seemed like a big ask, particularly as I'm not even really a physicist. But I wanted to just link something of what the Bible says about humanity as a way to address some of the challenges we get from cosmology and the Big Bang. So just very, very quickly, the whole idea of the Big Bang has something inherently very implausible about it. And I think we sometimes need to rename theories. I call evolution the life made itself theory. And the Big Bang is saying everything has come from nothing. It's the everything from nothing theory. And that immediately makes it sound slightly implausible. And ironically, I think Richard Dawkins agrees with me. He says, of course, it's counterintuitive that you can get something from nothing. Of course, common sense doesn't allow you to get something from nothing. That's why it's interesting. It's got to be interesting to give rise to the universe at all. Something pretty mysterious had to give rise to the origin of the universe. Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. A different way of putting it is that if you believe in the Big Bang, you're believing in the virgin birth of the cosmos. We are not the only people, if you like, with implausible ideas. People like to think that, what we're saying as creationists is terribly implausible. Well, actually, everyone has their own implausible ideas, and we can sort of push back on that a little. And a key assumption that underlies the cosmological model is actually not simply the Big Bang, but is this idea that there is nothing special about the Earth, or indeed humanity. We are not in some special position. It's not as if somehow the universe was made for us. We are simply what happens to have been sort of spewed out by the Big Bang. We are simply just what has happened. And that is a key assumption behind cosmology. And it's sometimes expressed in terms of our sort of insignificance, that we're just a speck on a speck of a planet, in a speck of a solar system, in the speck of a galaxy, in the midst of a vast universe. And of course, there's some truth to that. We are very small. But that doesn't mean that we don't have significance, because the Bible presents a totally different picture to this. And it's actually something very anthropocentric. As you read Genesis 1, what is striking to me is how much of creation is talked about in terms of humanity. Even the cosmos. Genesis 1:14, God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark the seasons and days and years." What this is saying is that God made the cosmos as a watch for humanity. Imagine getting a nice watch for Christmas. Well, God has basically made the cosmos as this timepiece for humanity. So it's saying actually humanity is very special. The Earth is special. The Big Bang cosmology says there's nothing special. Which fits the evidence better? We could look at the fine-tuning of the universe for the way life is possible. This is a common argument you'll find amongst different Christians. I think it's a very strong argument. Atheists agree this is a strong argument. But I want to focus on a different aspect, the fact that the Earth is special. It's very hard to have a planet that is ideal for complex life. It needs to be the right size, so that gravity is the right value, the right atmosphere, the right distance from the sun, the tilt, the speed of rotation, the size of the moon, all these things. It's really hard to get all of that right in one planet. But there's the universe is very big, there's lots of solar systems, there's lots of planets. Maybe it's possible that at least one of those planets could be suitable for life. That's not such a great coincidence. But what is so striking about the Earth is that it's also ideally placed for observing the universe. It's actually ideally placed to have perfect eclipses of the sun. It's very hard to get a perfect eclipse of the sun. You need the sun, the moon, and the earth in line at the right relative distance to each other to get a perfect eclipse. There's a very, very low probability that a planet would have this configuration with a moon and a sun. Well, isn't it incredible that the one planet where you get a perfect eclipse is the one place where there's intelligent life to see it, and can actually even use that eclipse as a way to study the universe, and indeed actually as a way to keep time. Eclipses have been used to date historically. Isn't that interesting how that links back to Genesis 1? These are two independent coincidences. To me, it looks like someone made it this way. The Bible seems to fit what we see, and you find more about that in there's a book and a video, The Privileged Planet. I'll leave these up here as other resources you can follow. Is it really possible to be a young earth creationist in the face of the overwhelming scientific evidence that counts against it? 2 short articles that. And if you want to download that booklet, I think you can do that from the website using this link. And there's other stuff on the website you can find, but I'll stop there for questions.